Hello, everyone. This is a very exciting conference for me because we're joining, we have several excellent people with us today to talk about the coronavirus and the effect on democracy. And I think actually we might talk about a lot more if we have time. This is organized jointly by the International Affairs Network and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Madrid. My name is Inês Domingos. I'm chair of the International Affairs Network. And I'll give the floor straight away to Willem Hofmeister, who is the director of CAS for Spain and Portugal. Willem, please.
Thank you very much, Inês. I just want to say hello to the panelists. I'm very grateful for the opportunity that we can have this international talk over the continent. So I'm grateful to Mr. Russell Mead from Washington, Marina Caetano from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and Miguel Morgado from Spain. At the moment, it was not possible. Also in Spain, as well as in many other countries, the issue of democracy is on the table. We all are asking, what does this virus do, not only with our health and health systems, but also with our democracy? In Germany, we have demonstrations, manifestations, because people is complaining. Although in Germany, the situation was not as strict as in many other countries, but of course, governments all over the world restricted civil liberties. And now we have to ask, what is this coronavirus doing with our democracy? We see that some populist governments are trying to get benefits out of the crisis. But we also can see that some established governments are enforced or are supported by the people. So I'm happy that we can discuss this issue this afternoon, and I would like to thank very much to Inês and her team of the International Affairs Network for making this meeting possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me start by introducing our speakers today. Walter Russell Mead is well known to most of us. He's a distinguished fellow of the Hudson Institute and Global View columnist of the Wall Street Journal. Marina Caetano is with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Brazil, where she's a project manager. And Miguel Morgado is a professor of the Political Studies Institute at Universidade Católica. And welcome to all. And thank you for being here at such different times of your day. I would like perhaps to start with Walter, if that's okay. And would you like to, each of you, to make a short, shall we say 10-minute intervention, and then we can ask some questions? Is that all right?
Sure.
And
all right.
Yes, Walter, would you like to go ahead, please? Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, you know, it's very difficult to talk about something like COVID-19's effect on democracy, because I think we're going to see it play out very, very differently in different parts of the world. Most of the COVID victims have been in relatively well-developed countries. And maybe in the end, though, the greatest impact is going to be in the global south, where in Nigeria, I think there's a bad outbreak in Kano, and this may be spreading. Obviously, Brazil is having some difficulties. We don't quite know how things will work out in places like India and Pakistan. But the big variable in some ways as to what kind of impact it's going to have on democracy is going to be the resilience of democracy in different countries, the economic impact of the pandemic. Even in some countries in the developing world where the pandemic itself may have limited public health, they may not have a big epidemic, the economic consequences of a capital, the collapse in commodity prices and so on, that may fundamentally have a much deeper and more long-lasting impact on democracy in those countries than public health measures taken, at the sort of peak of an epidemic. And so we ought to be asking ourselves to some degree what's going to happen, say, in a country like Kenya, where you have maybe the greatest locust swarms of modern time coinciding with a public health emergency, coinciding with a global economic collapse whose effects will be felt at every level of society. That's a very different problem than, what will the effects be in the US or Belgium of police doing contact tracing. But even within the looking at so far with the pandemic, you can see that in countries that have kind of deep, well-established democratic traditions, the pandemic, there was an emergency suspension of civil liberties at the time, but very quickly pressures are being felt and the political system is reacting. We're worried in some cases whether the lockdown would end too quickly rather than whether an iron-fisted government is going to clamp down indefinitely. So I think by and large, where democracy was robust before the pandemic, it will probably survive the pandemic reasonably well. But where you had less historical experience with democracy or counter-democratic forces already active, then you may see a very different outlook.
Thank you. Thank you, and that's a very interesting point, especially the last one you made, because I think it actually transitions nicely to a question I wanted to ask Miguel later. But Miguel, would you like to do a first 5 to 10 minute intervention before we get to questions?
Thanks. Well, I also would like to start by repeating something Walter had just said, or he also began with that proviso, which is we're not going to have a uniform response to the crisis in terms of democracy, in terms of economic performance, or institutional resilience. The wonderful first sentence in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina says it all, right? If we change it, and we can say that every prosperous democracy, all prosperous democracy are alike, but I guess each embattled democracy is unhappy in its own way. And I guess that's very true. Also, this whole process is going through very different phases. So we have the first phase, and I guess we are just concluding the first phase, which is a response of massive political, institutional, and economical response in terms of a shutdown to the virus and the pandemic threats. And although there were differences in approach, of course, in terms of in terms of public policy, in terms of what public opinion was going to say about the curtailment of civil liberties, the lockdown, and all that. Now we are going into the second phase, which is going to open up very different responses from societies, from political institutions, and from regions, from economic blocs. On the one hand, we had this extreme experience of concentration of power. All governments around the world who have responded to the pandemics, except in wartime. But you have to keep in mind that for many European societies, we haven't had experience of a wartime government or response for generations. It's not like America or Israel. So for Mediterranean democracies, this has been an unparalleled experience of concentration of power. And to go back to what Walter was saying, these Mediterranean democracies are not institutional quality, in terms of corruption, in terms of pure and sheer abuse of power by those who are in command. We don't have that resilience as compared to other democracies. Just a couple of points more, and then I'll shut up. If we go back to the long term, if we go back to the history of democracies in the last, say, 150 years in Europe and North America, we can say that an horizon of progress is good for democracy prospects. So if you want to keep this in a very colloquial language, you can say that optimism is good for democracy. But the reverse is also true. Pessimism or the elimination of an horizon of progress is bad for democracy. People tend to lose faith in democracy if they have a pessimistic outlook towards the future. I would propose this for the discussion as a general rule. And the way I see it now, although we don't know what's going to happen in the next few months, right? But as far as I can tell, this pandemic in Europe, not saying this is true about America or China, but it's true about Europe, I would say. This has removed a lot of the elements that were there to make an horizon of progress. So first you had the pandemic, a sense of vulnerability as you never experienced here in Mediterranean Europe. People were expecting in March, it was a general expectation that perhaps a third of the population could die. I mean, there was this sense of panic and fear, all those scenarios of catastrophe and collapse of all the institutions of the National Health Service, but also other stuff. It didn't come true, sure, but or another pandemic in 5 years' time. So a sense of vulnerability that you didn't have before. On top of that, you have to make comparisons, right? So after the Berlin Wall fell, the decades-long competition between a communist system on the one hand and a capitalist democratic system on the other came to an end. So we won, okay? But 10 years afterwards, or 15 years afterwards, a new competition came into place without us knowing, which may not be very powerful in Europe, but outside Europe, it sure is, in Africa, in South Asia, in parts of Latin America. And that race is between the American model and the Chinese model. So we're going to experience a very severe economic crisis, especially here. The economic crisis is not going to be uniform. Some are going through much more pain, a symmetric economic shock. It's all nonsense. There are no economic shocks, never. So this is going to be very asymmetric. And we here in Mediterranean Europe are going to have a deeper recession than others, than Northern Europe or than Eastern Europe. So if you add up all this stuff, that the horizon of progress is collapsing, and on the other hand, you're going to see in 6 months' time that you'll start to see, so let's check what are those institutions. And of course, some of those countries which are going to do better than others are strong democracies. Of course, I have strong faith, for example, in the way America and Germany are going to overcome this. But on the other hand, you're going to witness the strength of other models. Maybe China is going to deal much better with this pandemic in Europe. So we're going to begin to lose structural faith in the superiority of democracy in dealing with big challenges. And if we let ourselves get into this idea that this kind of threats are going to be a constant in the future, then the intensity of these comparisons is going to be felt much strongly in the future.
You're making, because perhaps about growth and democracy, or prosperity and democracy, because perhaps the voices that call for the economy to reopen sooner that come sometimes from people who are not usually very well regarded end up being right, in the sense that that might protect democracy more. So I would like to turn to Marina now. Out the nexus or the link between institutions and democracy and the response to the to this health crisis.
Thank you very much, Inês. I would like to thank the invitation one more time. Well, I think it was important that Walter and Miguel spoke before me, because I think I will focus much more in Brazil. And I totally agree when Walter says that it's not possible to make a very deep analysis of what will happen to democracy with the virus, but I can try to give some glimpse of what is happening already in Brazil. So when you ask the question, what is the virus doing to democracy in the country? So it has been enhancing the polarization that is part of our political and society in the country for the past 4 years. So it doesn't come as a surprise, because of most of you already know, we have a populist president that is unfortunately dealing with this issue in a very populist way. And of course, having a populist president in the middle of a pandemic, it is not exactly an easy task for a young Brazilian democracy. We have exactly 32 years of democracy, my age. And so the pandemic became a strong polarized political issue in Brazil, and which shows exactly some aspects of populism being used by the president and by some supporters inside the federal government. So since the beginning, a unified answer for for finding solutions. So there are different answers in different levels of governance, which of course makes the population confused on how to handle it. And he declared a few times that the results of an economic close down would be worse than the numbers of deaths related to the pandemic. And of course, economy is an issue. We have to think about economic recovery, as Miguel mentioned very well. But the problem is that economy, which is of course unnecessary to solve the problems and bring the solutions to the population. So as a populist, he takes legitimacy of reality and changes the fact to become himself the official reporter of the information that does not coincide with the realities that we are observing as citizens. And it's been working differently from not differently. He has not lost any support from his most faithful supporters since the beginning of the pandemic, which for me at least, and for some specialists, it comes as a surprise. So it means he has a very strong basis. And it means that the population is also so confused about what is happening in the country that supporting him, it makes sense. As a populist, he needs to have an enemy, as a common enemy. So everything that is against what is his proposals and his ideas is considered a communist or leftist. And so there is now a kind of a narrative also of a polarized society between who is defending science and who is defending the government, which is of course another aspect of populism, to completely ignore scientific aspects of the problem you're trying to face. And of course, the polarization and social discontent helps feeding this populism in Brazil right now. The population, they want simple solution for complex problems, exactly like the ones we are facing right now. It's not something that we'll face quickly. It's something that should be thinking the long term. And unfortunately, we do not have leaders, and we do not have a leader right now thinking in the long term. As Miguel said, that we need to be careful on economic recovery and so on. Another point that is very worrying from the Brazilian perspective, that it might have some similarity with the US, is also the critics on the press and demonstrations against democracy. So it is not a surprise. The federal government and the president have always been very critical to the press, but it seems that it has increased during the pandemic. Whenever they show the numbers and show the facts and what is happening in Brazil, that there seems to be attacks from the federal government. And not only this, unfortunately, we also had a few attacks on the streets for the press. So if the press is covering a demonstration city, they have been attacked a few times, which of course it doesn't come in a high point for our democracy. And usually the aggressors are supporters of our president. And well, another issue that should concern the institutions in Brazil is that some supporters are showing posters now at some demonstrations asking for military intervention, asking to close the judiciary in the military. They are a minority, we have to face that, but we should be vigilant. The society and the institutions should be vigilant. As most of you know, we do not establish a culture of debate about the dictatorship in the past. So we are a young democracy that doesn't know, the society doesn't know how to handle their rights and duties and doesn't understand how it functions. So this amnesia culture from the dictatorship, we're not having an Erinnerungskultur, as the Germans had, it's a big problem. It doesn't seem to be understood by the population. Some people still recall the dictatorship as the golden years, or a time it was safer to live in a Brazilian city. So we have to be really vigilant on that, even though there is a small minority. And of course, all the movement anti-science of the. Please, Inês, let me know if I have been through my time.
No, it's okay. You have a few minutes.
Okay. Okay, perfect. And also this disbelief in science and not having the people submit to what he wants. He fired 2 ministers. Well, one quit and the other fired himself, and the other was fired by the president in the middle of the pandemic. So it means we do not have a health minister at the moment, which is very worrying. And what should also be, we should be looking is that we have a general that is not a doctor and is actually appointing more military officials into Brazilian government, which is also another point to be looking at. Bolsonaro has, of course, surrounded himself with a lot of militaries, but now with the pandemic, it seems these numbers have increased. So the latest numbers, we have 17 appointments of names in the military to work in the health ministry, although they do not have anything related to a health background or any historic on working on that. So we should definitely be taking a look on that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Now I'll take the opportunity, given that I'm actually talking with you, to ask a few round of questions, and then we'll open the floor. So that will give time to the people who are participating in this meeting to write down is here on Zoom, so that if you write your name, if you have a question and write up your name, we'll call you up in by order. So just write up your name and we'll call you up and open your microphone so that you can ask questions. And as you start doing that, I'll ask 3 quick questions to our guests. First, to Walter, I think it's interesting to look at the case of not fully related, but somewhat related. First, the point that Miguel made, that actually the impact on growth might actually be worse if the decline in growth is too fast and too prolonged and the recovery does not take hold very fast. That is definitely a risk to democracy and to institutions, because that tends to incentivize populism, etc. So in some ways, it may be that that the calls from President Trump and President Bolsonaro to end lockdown might actually, surprisingly, be positive for democracy. Although most people or news places and the media tend to be very critical of that type of talk. So that was one question. The second question is about the role of multilateral institutions, and I think it's important to talk about quite often criticized for well, for threatening to cut down the funding at the time when it's actually needed to have an international response or a coordinated response. But on the other hand, it might also be a signal or an important sign for those multilateral institutions. And there was criticism, for instance, of WHO for not taking into account the opinion initially of other countries that are doing things much better, but that were not well regarded by China. So is there a case for arguing that actually the US response in threatening or at least pointing out to the WHO that they need to change the ways they're doing things and perhaps become less reliable? So that was my question for you, and we can start, and then I'll ask the other two. Thanks.
All right. Well, look, I mean, the U.S. response to the pandemic has been, I would say, pretty chaotic and confused. And probably our worst response was in New York City, unfortunately, where particularly the mayor was and the city administration were doing things like encouraging people to go to the Chinese New Year celebration and sort of saying you're racist if you don't go to celebrate Chinese New Year. And this is already when the pandemic is spreading. And the mayor refused to close public schools because, you know, and it's a real reason. You know, this is where kids were getting hot meals. Kids from poor families get their lunches in school, and you take that away, and what do they have? But the effect in terms of spreading the pandemic was enormous, and it's in precisely the poorest areas of the city where the pandemic has really hit. So we've had that. On the other hand, in Washington State and California on the West Coast, where the pandemic began earliest, actually the response, you know, we seem to have managed it pretty well. And the US death rate per million is really quite low. I mean, if you compare individual cases, the US, particularly with European countries, the US does not look good. But if you compare it with cases per million, and you realize in a sense that the US is better compared to the EU as a whole than any one country within it, including, by the way, the regional variations in the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. It hadn't been that terrible for something that none of us actually still understand. Does hot weather slow the pandemic? No. I would say the most profound unknown in some ways, other than will the virus mutate in ways that make it even more dangerous, is will the economic impact at some point, which we've already obviously seen, but will it impact the financial system in some way that causes a kind of a cascading collapse inside the financial system that so far and so instead of, we start looking at a much more severe and long-lasting economic downturn and one that's much harder to fix. Until we know whether we're dealing with something like that, we still don't know the name of this thing. We don't know the size of the problem. We don't know the scope of it. So the US response to the pandemic is like every country's response to the pandemic. We're making it up as we go along, and parts of it are proving successful and parts are not. This lockdown issue that you mentioned is very interesting because public health, the advice of public health professionals in the face of this phenomenon has changed several times. So, and there was a time when if you were a good person, you believed that lockdowns were the only possible answer, and the longer the lockdown and the more severe, the better it was. And that is, I think, partly reflects the experience in New York where they failed to do it early enough, and the consequences really were extraordinary. But as we've gone on with this thing, Sweden is not actually having a horribly worse pandemic than other places. So their failure to do the orthodox lockdown has not been the disaster that some predicted. On the other hand, the economic impact of the pandemic in Sweden has also been severe. So that both the pro-lockdown people and the anti-lockdown people have actually failed to predict what would happen completely. And that's in the nature, the part of the problem with this pandemic is we are not used as societies to dealing with problems that we just fundamentally don't understand. And so, our technocrats are used to being able to go look up in the books on their libraries and find the right answer. And then then the job of good politicians is to apply the correct answer that the technocrats have given. But what happens when we're facing a new virus and a new public health situation and a new interplay of the economy and the virus and the pandemic that none of us know what to do? So 6 months from now, we will all be a lot smarter than we are now. And we will all be able to say all kinds of things we should have been doing now that we just don't know about. So we'll see.
Well, thanks. We already have one question, so I'll ask Professor André Azevedo Alves to to come and ask his question.
Thanks, Inês. First, let me thank Walter, Miguel, and Marina for their interventions. My question is brief and directed to all three in their different contexts. So assuming the probability, we don't know for sure, no one knows, as Walter was just now saying, but assuming the possibility that there may be a second, and also that assuming that this second wave may perhaps bring about calls for a second wave also of lockdowns, how do they see the political implications of this second wave, not so much of the virus per itself, but of a second wave of lockdown, especially in liberal democracies? Thanks.
So perhaps Miguel would like to go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Just let me, before I get to the question, let me just add to something that Walter has just said. If we check the regional diversity within Europe in terms of the impact of the pandemics, there are a lot of things that we don't know. So the last hit region in Europe was Eastern Europe, Eastern and Southeastern Europe. I haven't heard a single person giving me a good reason why was that, and I think that's decisive to know what happened. So we had a lot of speculation about, in March, say, about our predictions of how severely would a country be hit. We would take into account the quality of the national health system and the amount of people, the depth of links to China, whatever. So, and then everything happens, and you check that countries like Greece, like Hungary, like Poland, they were practically not hit by the crisis. And what happened? We don't know. Within Italy, and you go and check what happened in Italy, which was really a nightmare, no matter what the angle that you try to analyze the situation in Italy. The northern part, which by the way has a far better national health system than the southern region in Italy, was by far hit the worst as compared to what happened in Rome and Naples and even the islands. So there's a lot of things that we don't know, and that's a good way to start my attempt to answer Andre's question. A lot of in European democracy are going to try to stabilize public opinions by saying this was something that happened to us, no political responsibility here. So we are trying to deal with this, and it will quickly go away, right? So if you don't have a second wave, it all went away, and you focus on economic recovery, and then you will see if there is a so-called V-shaped recovery, and if that happens, well, that's all for the best, and things are going to be wonderful as they were. If not, if it's not a V-shaped recovery, as I think it won't be, then everything is up for grabs, really. So if a second wave comes and then you have a second wave of lockdowns, people will begin to say explicitly that these guys don't have a clue. I mean, our institutions are not equipped to deal with this. I mean, I understand, an average citizen here in Europe, or especially in Mediterranean Europe, I'm focusing a lot on Mediterranean Europe because I think we are very, very vulnerable at the moment. I think no one should underestimate the amount of economic and social devastation that is going on here. It's not like in Northern Europe, it's much worse than that. So, and why there was a lockdown. Even though a couple of scientists come up and say, well, the lockdown was a terrible idea. People will say, well, but at the time, no one knew. So I'm not going to say bad things about our institutions, our politicians. But if we try all this again without innovating in our approach, on top of a very severe social and economic crisis, people are not going to accept that. And I mean, I'm saying this even in countries like Hungary or Portugal, in which the respective governments are very able to control public opinion and public information. In Portugal, we have a very severe problem of lack of democratic accountability and really, the ability of the press to scrutinize the government's actions. And I would say that that bonus that the present government has will exhaust itself. More vulnerable and on the ropes here in Mediterranean than people tend to think outside this region.
Thank you. Marina, would you like to answer Andre's question as well, given that it was for the three of you?
I'll try. It is, I think, as the other panelists were also mentioning, it's hard to bring a clear perspective, but I guess I'll try to divide into parts. So when it comes to Brazil, I guess, Andre, we have much more of a social discontent, and with maybe more demonstrations in the streets, and it might come place more authoritarian measures from the federal government. This is unfortunately what I see. As longer as it lasts, I guess it opens more doors to more authoritarian measures. And also, our political economy in Brazil right now was totally related to less state intervention. And what we have seen, and if it continues like this, if we have a second phase for a lockdown, we will need more state intervention in Brazil, which is against the policies of our current federal government. So there will be some kind of clash, and I don't know what's going to come from that. And when it comes in a more global perspective, I think the only way, a way to deal with it, it should be more they should intense the international cooperation, coordinated cooperation between governments and multilateral institutions, which unfortunately in the example of Brazil is not happening. But I think this is the way of trying to deal with the second phase of a lockdown, for example.
Okay, thanks. And finally, Walter, would you like to add something as well?
I think what I'd say is that again, and on the nature of but if there is a second stage, a second round, first of all, in a lot of places, you'll have a lot of voluntary lockdown, in the sense, the reason I'm not going outdoors today is not because I would get a ticket from the police. I probably wouldn't. It's because I don't want to get COVID, and So I don't perceive myself as being forced into my apartment by the action of a tyrannical state. I see myself as making a very sensible decision to keep myself out of the line of fire. And I think a lot of people do see that. A lot of people don't, particularly I think if you're much younger, and what you're hearing is that young people are not nearly as much at risk. And then of course I can work just as well from my apartment as I can from my office. In fact, I hope I never have to go back to my office again. I am so very happy working in my own apartment with everything I like and all my books around me. It couldn't be better. So you're going to have very different responses. My guess is, at least in the US, and I'm sure in some other countries, if we have to do this in the fall, Amazon is going to be much better. The grocery stores, at home delivery, all the systems that have been invented on the, in this moment of crisis. I mean, when it began, it was very hard to get grocery deliveries to your home in Washington, because all of a sudden everyone wanted to do it and the system was overloaded. But now we have all these services, have hired lots more delivery people. And now it's actually, I could have, anything except toilet paper delivered to me, 7 times a week if I wanted to. So in that sense, the system has clearly adjusted. Again, the problems are the people who can't work from home and whose lives are whose restaurant owners and waiters and people who work in bars and, coffee shops and all of this, their lives are getting ripped up in a much more profound way. And I think a second wave would have bigger impacts on things like commercial real estate that would last a long time, because right now already a lot of companies are saying, wait a minute, we've been having everyone work at home for 2 months and everything is fine. Our company is working as well as we ever did. Why are we paying these enormous rents in downtown Manhattan for something that doesn't actually add to our bottom line? If we go through this experiment that a lot of things would change. If we think about how bringing that back to the question of democracy, what that means is that the tax base of a lot of central cities, which is already under a great deal of pressure, New York, San Francisco, some others, they're going to face a profound crisis, because there'll be a commercial real estate crash that will be the loss of a lot of their tax base. So where do they pay for the services that their citizens need, for the pensions, for retired civil servants, and so on? So I think if we get I don't see this, again, in the US anyway, and that's, we might have a problem with our election, but I think we're moving to the postal ballot pretty clearly, which is lots of potential for fraud in postal ballots. But I don't think that's a long-term systemic threat to our democracy. We'll adjust, but the consequences, the social change, and therefore the economic and political change that's caused by the pandemic will be that much deeper if we go through this again.
Yes, very, very right. Thank you very much. We have another question from Professor Mónica Dias from Instituto de Estudos Políticos at Católica. You can talk now, I think. Yes.
Thank you so much, Inês and Willem. That's a great initiative. And I hope it's the first of a series of conferences, as Walter said now. Maybe we will get used to it, and this is an advantage. I only would not agree with a question of, for example, if you have children at home. I understand that it's great to work at home. But if you have small children at home, well, I could send you some for a few days. And maybe you would make a very different experience in your beautiful apartment that we can see. Well, anyway, what I wanted to say is that when we discuss the effect of COVID on democracy, of this pandemic on democracy, of course, one of the first things that comes to my mind is when we lose civil rights. So the rights that the freedoms we have, of social contact. But there's another freedom that I'm very afraid of. And it's, if we think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt idea of freedom from fear. Because I think that this illness brought fear into our societies. And fear is one of the factors that threatens completely. So I believe it is not possible to have liberal democracy if you live in fear. And of course, this fear also leads to many, many conspiracy theories, to fake news, to a variety of absurd information, and also to polarization, and all these consequences or collateral effects, of course, endanger democracy. And I'm very worried about this, so I would like to hear you on that. And another question, also of course, the other members of the panel, and Marina and Miguel, of course. And the other question has to do with something that you mentioned in the beginning. So the idea that democracies, liberal democracies, do not seem to be dealing better with this pandemia than illiberal. But look, we really do not know how autocratic regimes are dealing with this, because we do not know. And most of the people who try to inform about the reality that's happening on the ground of these countries are imprisoned, or will be tortured, or worse, or will disappear forever. So we don't know anything about the numbers. So I have great doubts about the numbers of Turkey, about the numbers even of Hungary, and so just to stay in Europe. Okay, and of course, the numbers of Russia will not be, or I don't trust them, and also, well, we don't need to talk about China, of course. Mm-hmm. But anyway, what I want to say is that the presumption that is made is, in my view, extremely wrong and unfair regarding the capacity that liberal democracy still has.
Thank you. So shall Walter start first?
Sure. Well, I'd be happy to receive the children, but I understand that under the quarantine, they're really not allowed to travel. So maybe another time. But that's part of what I mean by the adjustment. You see, if the first pandemic, or the first lockdown, no one knows what they're doing, and suddenly they've got 3 small children. Guess if this happened again, a lot of people would think about different things, like maybe 3 or 4 families would swap off, and the kids would move from one place to another, so that we would come up with these sort of small scale creative solutions to this, or maybe we would just start giving the kids more drugs so that they would sleep all day. I'm sure that's crossed the minds of a lot of parents during the lockdown. But yeah, we will adjust to these things. You're absolutely right on the question of comparing authoritarian and non-authoritarian responses to this. We can tell even from the outside that the Russians have not handled this well, and they know it. We see in China the fact that they've expelled so many foreign newspaper reporters, and that so many Chinese citizen reporters have disappeared, etc. This isn't because there's a lot of good news in China they want to share with us. And so it's again, it's a reasonably safe bet that what we are seeing is something like just the tip of the iceberg of what's happening. But even that is concerning enough, because we're already getting, China has reintroduced lockdowns in the Northeast. We're seeing that things like movie theaters are opened and then they're immediately shut again. There's just a lot of uncertainty. I see just today the Chinese announced that they no longer are they're not setting an economic goal for 2020. So China has handled this brilliantly, is probably not a very good one. And in general, China seems to have lost prestige up to this point. Now the competition, in a sense, the really interesting thing about this is that South Korea and Taiwan, two democracies in Asia, have actually managed this thing pretty well. Now, again, we're in early stages. Anything could happen. But, the strong argument to be made is that the Asian democracies have managed this thing well. It's partly, I think, because with SARS and MERS, Asia has had a series of pandemic scares. Most of them, incidentally, start originating in China. But they've had this series of scares, and so they had thought more about systems. They've gone through contact tracing and stuff. Again, my guess is that, once we're through this, in a lot of our countries, you're going to find a lot of people in a lot of different governments looking at what worked and what didn't work. And so if 4 years from now a new pandemic virus arises, more countries will be looking like South Korea. But to, the Brazilian case, and Marina, thank you for bringing the Brazilian perspective is a fascinating one, because Brazil is, some people have called President Bolsonaro the Trump of the tropics. I'm not sure that's fair either to Trump or to the tropics in a sense. But a populist confronted with a problem that you can't solve is a fascinating thing to watch, because they can only try to kind of manufacture or create a public perception that is beneficial to them. You see all of the rhetorical tricks, the polarization, the obfuscation, the distraction. You can actually see this, and I think Trump's, I don't know who, I'm sure none of his advisors told Trump that he should do 3 hours a day of nonstop television improvisation, because you sort of see with the mask off. You see him trying to kind of invent something as he goes, and it's not very convincing. But then the thing that you look at is, again, if you look at results, Trump's America is not doing worse than other countries in terms of death per million. If the US were in Europe, it would actually be above average in its response. And if you take, by the way, New York out of it, it would be an extremely beneficial set of statistics. So the populist, it's interesting that the bad populist governance has not had as much effect on the national response to the pandemic as one might think, because one would like to tell this as a morality tale. There are some countries who had good institutions and strong leaders, and these countries had very low death rates. And then there were the countries with bad leaders and populist ideas, and these countries, they really got punished. That's the sort of, the story we would like to be able to pull out of this thing. The reality is not conforming to those expectations in the way one might expect, which just suggests to me that we all have a lot to learn here. This pandemic has not finished teaching us things.
Thank you, thank you. You're completely right. And now we have several questions. So I think I'll round up the next few questions, starting with Luis, and then Roberto, and then Willem Hofmeister. So Luis, I'll open up your Luis Bravo. Please go ahead.
Okay, so hi all. Two questions, and one of them to Walter, which is regarding the U.S. elections that we already spoken here. But we have seen, of course, huge polarization of the political rhetoric, shift for with this COVID-19 thing. So either for the response, but especially because the president has, Donald Trump has anti-China speech and WHO and WHO speech, anti-WHO speech on while probably on profiting for a better trade deal or whatever. My question is, it's a bit more on one sense, on looking at the other side of this wall between the two parties, and asking if what part of this elections would we see, for example, a common agreement, a common sentiment towards less China in the US, or in the world? Would we see Joe Biden defending a lot of, even if with less anti-China rhetoric, less China on the future United States role? And I would leave the likes of Miguel Morgado regarding Spain. So we have seen a lot of this, a little bit of political turmoil also on Spain and in Europe, and of course Europe is always late, arriving late. So we can say about whatever we can about the shift in turns that in the US have been done, but they have committed, and part of what we have seen in the markets and some signs of stabilization has to do with that quick and whatever it can take response to the economy. Here we are still discussing a bit what we are going to do 3 months afterwards, and we are seeing some signs of political unrest, especially just right beside us in Spain. And my question goes directly: what are your comments on this, and what is the implications of this, for example, for Portugal, being Spain what it is in terms of economical relation for not a, I wouldn't say a V-shaped recovery. I think that's impossible for Portugal, but a less L-shaped, a less long-shaped recovery, and basically that's it. So,
thank you. Now Roberto Varandas, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to ask the question. I just wanted to maybe comment on one fundamental sort of pillar of democracy, which is the press. The press is ever more polarized. I mean, just yesterday, for example, and picking up on Walter's point, just yesterday I saw how the press treats Cuomo versus the governor of Florida, for example, just because they are from two different parties. Cuomo is portrayed as a hero. The governor of Florida, some sort of villain, because he decided to let go some low functionary in the statistics office of some sort. And you know, in Portugal, you know, we had this huge sort of kudos for the government is at best mid to bottom of the table in terms of the deaths. You know, a little snarky remark to Marina: if the press has a problem in Brazil, they should just come to Portugal. They'll get a subsidy from the government. You know, you're also seeing new media, you know, on this and having a completely polarized view. YouTube and Facebook do not allow for posts that are anti-WHO recommendations or that provide alternative points of view. They're censoring everything. Spain is policing social media. The leader of the extreme left-wing party that's in government was caught talking about how they were policing social media. Isn't it worrying also where the press is going, and also new media, which is the new press? Aren't we all worried about where this is going? Because suddenly, you know, you at some point you won't be able to have a different opinion. I mean, I myself, I'm very concerned about it. So I just kind of ask this open question about the role of the press and how you think this will evolve.
Thank you. And Willem Hofmeister, I think your mic is on.
Okay, thank you. I would like to come back to this democracy issue. We can see that the competition between the US and China is increasing. It is already, over the last 2 years, it increased steadily, but now we can see that it is on a very high point of conflict. And when we look to the polls and to the international reaction, so there are a lot of opinion that China is gaining out of the crisis on international acceptance and its image. We have recent polls, for instance, in Germany, where more Germans starting to trust China more than the US. This has to do with governance. This has to do with the men who are in front of the government. Countries, but it's also a competition between two systems. And therefore, I think it's not only my worry, but it's also the worry of other people who are writing about this, that this can really harm the future of democracy, of the democratic system, of the acceptance of our system, of our Western democratic system, that China is gaining ground. And one topic in the context of this issue is how international and multilateral institutions are dealt with by the different governments. We see that the US is withdrawing from different international multilateral institutions, and now this conflict with the WHO. So my question is whether this can have an impact on the acceptance of liberal democracy in ask Marina regarding with regard to Brazil. We have seen a lot of conflicts over the last months, although already before coronavirus, and we have seen that there are a series of applications for impeachment are presented to the Congress, and we see that this is one aspect, and the other aspect is that the cooperation between the national government and the federal states is not in a very good shape. So the things are going with regard to these 2 points. Do you see a possibility to strengthen the cooperative aspects of Brazilian democracy? Or do you see that these institutional pillars of the democracy are also under pressure?
So who would like to go first to these 3 questions? Miguel, perhaps?
Oh.
Okay, I'll go. Well, starting with China, starting with Willem's question, I would say that without us Europeans acknowledging that perhaps the biggest legacy of Trump as president, if he loses in November, is actually this new attitude that we have towards China. So here in Europe, I would say that everything changed in the last year or 2 years at most. So until 2 years ago, China was a great partner. And there was no concern whatsoever about the sustainability of this very stretched global supply chains. No concern at all. Then we started to change European Union by creating this agency that is supposed to screen foreign direct investments in strategic industries in Europe, within Europe. Of course, it was designed to stop at least a part of predatory, so-called predatory foreign direct investment coming from China. Then we had this, before the pandemics, we had this new approach that we should begin to think about changing the rules about state aid, or to change the rules, the general rules about competition policy within the single market. Remember the aborted merger between two big French and German producers, train producers? It was aborted by the European Commission, and there was a political backlash in the name of making both Europe more self-sufficient and keeping China away from the European market. Then the pandemics came, and I think it changed a lot of stuff. I think now there's a lot of political support, both at the elites level as well as the popular level, to rearrange these global supply chains, even if it is at the cost of some significant economic costs. America is led by Trump. Well, at least they're talking about it. They're going to do something about it. Japan also is very keen on giving money to Japanese companies to come back to this onshore movement. And I guess Europe is thinking about doing the same thing. But it's not, to go back to Monica's question, it's not that I'm concerned about the competition coming from autocracies, or whether autocracies as such are able to deal better with emergencies like this than liberal democracies. It's China. I mean, no one cares about having their own country look like Russia or Turkey or Iran, which, by the way, is an autocracy, and it was dealt with the pandemics terribly. It's afraid of the Chinese economy, of China as an economic powerhouse. It's not because they're weak, because they are perceived, wrongly or rightly, doesn't matter, they're perceived as being much stronger than we are. And then people start to think, so how come the Chinese have become so much stronger than we did? And some of the interlocutors in this discussion may raise their hands and say, well, they have different institutions. Why don't we imitate some of their institutions? Of course, this is not going to persuade the public in England or in Denmark or in the Netherlands. But it's persuading a lot of people outside Europe, of course, in the so-called third world or in the so-called developing countries. And if we have the experience in Europe of having here a failed experience, like we almost did, remember, in Greece some years ago, well, those sorts of arguments, they are vocalized by a talented populist leader. So to answer Roberto's warning about the frailty of the press and the new media, I was making the case in my first statement that we are witnessing a very dangerous concentration of power by national governments in Europe. It's the same thing in the outside world, but I'm concerned about Europe now. this concentration of power is extremely dangerous. On top of all the things that the governments had to do in order to impose a lockdown to keep people at home, now we are seeing the effects of these very large government intervention in the economy. This is an immense opportunity for corruption and abuse of power. I have no doubt in my mind that this is opening right now an immense and very dangerous window of opportunity for corruption in a very big scale and abuse of power in a very big scale. And how big is that scale? Well, it's the scale that says governments are able to blackmail every autonomous force in civil society with these kinds of resources that are being used in the name of this so-called economic recovery. And again, it's not the same thing to have a government spending, I don't know, 10% of GDP in helping directly companies and workers in Northern Europe or in Southern Europe. It's not the same thing. So here in Portugal, we have this I'm also very concerned about the unanimity around what you can read in the newspaper. We had this, I don't know how to describe this episode. The leader of the opposition here in Portugal wrote a letter to the rank and file of his own party, which is my party, by the way, in which he was admonishing people who criticized the government. People who were criticizing the government were not patriotic. I mean, this was said and written by the leader of the opposition himself, not by the prime minister, but by the leader of the opposition. I guess this gives you a clue about, in small democracy, in which a small democracy with a very weak civil society, governments are able really to control not only the state apparatus, but also civil society. And I'm very concerned about what's going to happen here and also in Spain as far as that problem goes in the next year or 2 years or 3 years. Very, very concerned. Luis was asking us about what I think about the relationship between Portugal and Spain when we witness what Spain is going through now. Well, yes, I'm very concerned about what happens in Spain, but don't forget that the simulacrum of recovery that we had in between 2014 and 2018 in Portugal, Spanish recovery. Now we'll have the backlash. We are so dependent on the Spanish economy, so immensely dependent that we'll have a backlash. I mean, I think it was Bank of America made this forecast that they are predicting a 10% drop in GDP for 2020 in Spain. If they have a 10% drop in GDP, I guess Portugal will have, if not 10%, at least 8, 9. I mean, we are as dependent as that. Portugal went into this crisis in an extremely vulnerable position. We have debt all around us, both public debt and private debt, and we became very, very dependent on tourism. So it's not good news, and we'll have a political crisis in Spain on top of that. But let me just finish and conclude. I know I'm talking for a long time now, but let me just conclude by saying something about Spain and about populism. The government in Spain was political situation, and they tried to create political legitimacy, the present government in Spain, by polarizing the debate even more. So a lot of populists in Europe, both in Southern Europe and Northern Europe, are seeing this crisis as an opportunity to make their own changes that wouldn't be accepted in normal times, but may be accepted now. But not all those populists are in governments. In Portugal, they are more or less in government. They support the governments on the left. But in Spain, they are in government. Pablo Iglesias has this notion that he is now in power. He won't let go power. He'll put out a fight if someone wants to take him down from there, and he wants to take advantage of the situation to transform the Spanish economy and Spanish society in a way that makes Podemos a indispensable force in government for the future. I have no doubt in my mind that that's his plan. And what we are witnessing in Spain right now is already a consequence of that plan by Podemos and the weakness of Sanchez of going along with that plan. I guess similar political is going to happen in other countries and in Europe, but right now in Spain, this is very concerning. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Marina, would you like to go?
Yeah,
answer some questions?
Yeah. So I think I know it was not directed to Brazil, but I guess I would like to talk a little about the anti-China rhetoric, because it is an issue in Brazil, because most of the president's supporters and the president itself has done some open criticism to China for exports, and it has become an issue during the pandemic with the son of Bolsonaro, Eduardo Bolsonaro, that criticized openly China and the Chinese virus, as he said in a tweet, and had that made Bolsonaro call Xi Jinping to apologize. And so it's very clear how dependent we are from China, and how like if you see there is an image that is very clear how the states of the income of the states of Brazil in export, it depends completely on China. So it's a very complicated and sensitive issue that the president is against the ideology, is against communism, but on the other hand depends totally economically on the country and anyway in the market that they share. About the press, Roberto, I think it's very, I think we are living different situations, but I guess what you say about the press and the new media, it's very important. I guess we are facing that as well. There is a proposal to try to regulate WhatsApp messages in Brazil in order to check if they are fake news or not, but who regulates that? Who says what is fake and what is a fact? So I think it's very complicated and it's very sensitive. And Mark Zuckerberg today, early this morning, I guess, he made a statement in Facebook saying that he's trying to close down some fake news that are being liberated during the pandemic. And he used Bolsonaro as an example, because Bolsonaro has been cut down a few times in Instagram, in Twitter, and on Facebook, being accused of spreading fake news. And although I know that some of them were fake news, I think it's very complicated to determine who regulates that. Is it Facebook? Is it the government? So who is doing that? And I think it's very problematic, and it should be in discussion with the civil society. And many impeachments now orders against Bolsonaro. One that comes from his former party, PSL, the Partido Social Liberal, and some of the opposition in Brazil, but he's trying to avoid that it goes to the Congress to be voted, Hofmeister, because he's trying to establish a few contacts with the center, the political center of Brazil, with some political parties, that he's always said that he would never commit himself to anything to those parties, but now he needs them in order to avoid that this go in. If it goes on the chamber for the deputies to be voted, he won't have the number to be impeached, because it is a possibility. I think it's a small possibility. There is a small percentage that is happening, and it has a lot to do with the interventions he was doing in the federal police in Brazil because of his son's investigations. But I could talk about it. This is another problem of the president, but it exploded during the pandemics, which of course makes everything even more sensitive. And about the states and the federal governments, I think I would say not only the states, but also the mayors, the cities, the representatives of the cities. This is one thing that I'm trying to see on the positive aspects, that the states and the cities, they have to act in a more decentralized way, because the federal government is not helping them and is not unifying the action. So it was very interesting to see that some states and cities took measures first than the federal government, of emergency supports to informal workers, or even the distribution of food in poor communities. So it was an interesting way to see decentralization being forced in Brazil somehow. And yes, the states have a lot of issues with Bolsonaro's. The governors, 21 of the 27 governors in Brazil have publicly say that they are against the president and against the measures that they are taking. Hofmeister, and there was a very pacified meeting because the meetings with the governors were open to public, and it was crazy. It was like a circles. They were, cursing and fighting in the middle of. It didn't seem anything Republican, yeah, as we say in Brazil. But yesterday they had a very peaceful meeting, very civilized. They tried to agree in a few aspects, and I understood afterwards that this is also a device of the Ministry of Economy, because every time we have more political instability, we lose value in our currency and in our economy. So I don't know if you are aware, but Brazil was the one that lost almost 40% of value in its currency. It's one of the countries that most lost value of currency during the pandemic. So I think he's trying to look at the economy in a more way and trying to be more sensitive when it comes to politics and trying to bring more unified action. So I hope that after this meeting yesterday, they can try to find the way to figure out their issues and try to find things together for the country.
Thank you. And Walter,
Okay.
would you like to say a final few words?
Yep, and I'll try to keep it short because I know we all have things to do. But one thing I realized is I did not respond earlier to Monica's very important point about fear and its role in liberal democracy. And I think it's just worth noting that actually what's interesting is the pandemic compared to past pandemics or other things is really not a very big deal. They say 50 to 100 million people were killed in the Spanish influenza 100 years ago, when the world's population was 1/3 what it is today. So, that would be 150 to something very small in comparison. The economic impact is bigger. But fear is a constant up until quite recently, a constant in human life. And as I think about my life in the United States, I was born when the polio epidemics were raging. And, that was a disease that primarily attacked children. During the early years of the United States, Washington had to close. And, so actually liberal democracy is much tougher than we might think. It grew up in conditions of fear, of terror, of conflict, of panic. And so we should not think of I think we are not being historically grounded if we think of liberal democracy as this fragile flower that can only endure in the most hothouse conditions. It's tougher than that. And that gives me a little bit of optimism in a time like this. There were two questions about the US and China. One sort of about how the Biden people would deal with it, and another about the impact of China's rising profile and what does that say about the future of liberal democracy. I'll try and answer them quickly together. I think the Biden people are going to make the case in the election, and I think they mean it, that they will be as opposed to China as Trump, in the sense of trying to curb China's military and other adventurism, but that they will be more effective at it than he will, basically because Biden isn't Trump, and will use multilateral institutions, use alliances, and so on in ways that Trump is either unwilling or unable to do. If you'd like to see more about their thinking, I did a conversation with Jake Sullivan, who was Biden's national security advisor when Biden was vice president and was in charge of policy planning at the State Department when Hillary Clinton was there. You can find that if you Google Jake Sullivan and me. I think we've had 2 conversations. and what a Biden administration would be like generally. So you might find that a useful thing to check. You know, it is the survey showing that in Germany now, China is more trusted than the United States by a lot of people, or is trusted by more people than the United States, is certainly an interesting and a troubling one. From time to time, one does get these surveys out of Germany, often in response to someone like a Trump or an event like an Iraq war. And we'll see whether it, you know, whether under a Biden presidency, we would return to the, you know, to a more normal configuration. I think it was interesting that China does better in the former GDR than it does in the rest of the country in these surveys. The other thing that we will, I think, want to think about going forward is that the next stage of China's planned economic development is a very direct challenge to the foundations of German economic power. And, you know, the attack on the internal combustion engine and the sort of China's attempt to kind of capture, to become the global center of the automobile industry and of innovation in automobiles. You know, the shift from internal combustion cars, where Germany has 100 years of comparative advantage, is a big one, because if you go from electric car to electric car from internal combustion, it's not like you just drop a new engine in the same box. Everything about the car is changed by this, and a lot of the German engineering advantage, a lot of what goes on in the Mittelstand is not, it becomes suddenly irrelevant. And we may see that, you do hear this from some people in the German automotive industry, that I think that, you know, that China is becoming a dangerous commercial rival for Germany. That may shift perceptions, not necessarily in a pro-US direction, but in an anti-China direction. We'll just have to see. Finally, on the press, again, I think this is really a question. The polarization is really troubling. This modern era of the professional civilized press is a fairly recent phenomenon. A newspaper reporter in the United States was not even really considered a white-collar profession until even the 1960s, that often reporters went from secondary school to working in the copy desk of a newspaper and then became reporters from there. The idea that you would go from Harvard and Yale to go work at the New York Times, and then that your writing would be in this kind of very professional manner, with some sort of ostensible commitment anyway to objectivity, is not the way the U.S. press historically worked. So I think, you know, leaving the institutional era of 3 networks, major news weeklies with a fairly contained, civilized discourse is over, driven by technological change, and it's not coming back. And that means many more points of view are now able to be expressed. Some of them are interesting, some of them are frankly horrifying and terrifying. And conspiracy theories, racist ideas, you know, a whole range of crazy ideas are now in the public arena. I think democracy has to accept this. You can't, you know, democracy is really about people having the right to make their own choices, to think their own thoughts, and then to express their beliefs in politics the way they would like to. I may not like your ideas. I may think they are poisonous. But I think if the problem that you raise is with that, who regulates it? You know, I'll let you own the newspapers, but I will regulate the press. Why don't we agree to that? That's, there is no solution to this in the ultimate sense. In some ways, it's like, how does a democracy control the military? That in the end, it is true that all power proceeds from the gun, but you can create a kind of a web of institutions and understanding in which the military accepts its subordination. And you can learn to live with the freedom of the press too. I think you have to, with the freedom of opinion. I guess I would close by saying that you cannot even, one of the problems that sometimes liberal democracies get into is that they do forget the importance of a culture of virtue among the citizens. That without virtue, none of the American founding fathers thought that the republic would last unless the population were virtuous, by which they and that ultimately an unhealthy society will not have a healthy government. And the government will not be that much better than the people for long. And so this is really, we should think of this as a challenge, how we teach our children, how we live in our communities, how our society is producing civic virtue, is really, that I think is the foundation of democracy. And without it, neither democracy nor autocracy nor anything else is going to work very well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for those inspiring thoughts. I think we're getting to the end. It's now, we've been talking, it was a very interesting debate with a very lively debate. So I'd like first to thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for this, for helping and hosting this event with us. And to thank as well all the participants in this meeting and all the questions that were asked. And finally, thanks all the panelists for very inspiring remarks. I think we'll all be thinking a lot more about this in the next few weeks. So thank you so much. I don't know, Willem, if you want to say a few words to end.
I think it was a nice debate. I thank you very much for the organization. I thank the panelists again for participating from very far. They have come to Portugal and to Spain. Thank you very much, and I hope we can continue with this kind of exchange. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.